The room had been filled with noise only seconds earlier. Guitars were being tuned, cables were being dragged across the floor, technicians shouted instructions from one side of the studio to the other. Someone laughed near the piano while a drummer tapped his sticks against his knee, waiting for the next rehearsal. And then Elvis Presley walked through the door. The atmosphere changed instantly. It was 1968, and Elvis was preparing for one of the most important performances of his career. After years of movies, recording sessions, and a changing music industry, he knew he had something to prove. He didn't want to simply return. He wanted people to remember why they had fallen in love with him in the first place. Elvis stepped onto the rehearsal floor wearing black, his dark hair carefully styled, his eyes moving across the musicians with quiet concentration. He listened, not just to the music, to the people making it. One guitarist caught his attention. The young man stood near the back of the room, holding an old electric guitar that looked as if it had survived more than one war. His clothes were simple, his shoes were worn, and unlike everyone else, he didn't seem impressed by the famous man standing 10 feet away. He was concentrating on his instrument. His fingers moved quickly across the strings. Elvis watched for several seconds. Then he smiled. "What's your name, son?" The guitarist stopped playing. He looked up. "Daniel." "Daniel what?" "Daniel Carter." Elvis nodded. "You're pretty good." Daniel smiled nervously. "Thank you, Mr. Presley." Elvis walked closer. "Pretty good." Daniel hesitated. "I suppose." Several musicians laughed. Elvis raised an eyebrow. "Oh, I suppose." Daniel immediately realized he had said too much. "I'm sorry." But Elvis laughed. "No, don't apologize. I like confidence." He looked at the guitar. "How long you been playing?" "Since I was 9. "And how old are you now?" 20. Elvis nodded slowly. 20. He looked around the room. 20 years old and already think you know everything. Everyone laughed again. Daniel smiled. But then Elvis pointed at the guitar. "Play something." Daniel looked surprised. "No." That's usually how playing works. The room erupted in laughter. Daniel took a breath. He positioned his fingers over the strings. And then he played. The first few notes were quiet. Then the melody grew. Daniel wasn't simply playing fast. He was playing with emotion. His fingers moved across the fretboard with confidence, bending notes until they seemed to cry. The guitar almost sounded like a human voice. Elvis stopped smiling. He listened carefully. When Daniel finished, there was silence. Then someone near the piano whispered, "Wow." Elvis slowly nodded. "That's good." Daniel lowered the guitar. "Thank you." Elvis walked toward him. "But I want to know something." Daniel looked up. "What?" "You can make that guitar scream." Elvis pointed toward the microphone. "But can you sing while you're doing it?" Daniel laughed. "I think so." Elvis grinned. "You think so?" Daniel nodded. "I know so." The room became quiet again. Elvis looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "All right." He turned toward the band. "Let's find out. Before we continue, tell me something. If you were standing in that rehearsal room in 1968, watching Elvis Presley challenge a young guitarist, would you have believed Daniel could actually pull it off? Hit like if you think he could. And write in the comments where you're watching from. I want to know how many different places are listening to this story. And if you enjoy emotional stories about legendary musicians, subscribe and stay with us. Because Daniel had no idea that his next mistake would change the entire atmosphere of that room. The musicians prepared themselves. Elvis chose one of his more demanding songs. Daniel listened carefully. He had played difficult guitar solos before. He had performed in clubs where audiences shouted and drank and barely paid attention. He had played through broken amplifiers and cheap speakers. But this was different. There was no drunken crowd here. No dark club. No anonymous audience. There was Elvis Presley standing directly in front of him. The man whose voice had influenced an entire generation. Daniel swallowed. Elvis noticed. Nervous. A little. Good. Daniel looked confused. Elvis smiled. Nerves mean you care. Then Elvis stepped toward the microphone. The band started. The drums came first. Then the bass. Then Daniel's guitar. The sound filled the room. Daniel began playing the opening sequence. Everything was going perfectly. Then Elvis gave him a signal. Sing! Daniel opened his mouth. His voice came out lower than expected. He followed Elvis's melody while his fingers continued moving over the guitar. For several seconds, it worked. The musicians looked at each other. Elvis watched him closely. Then the guitar became more complicated. Daniel's fingers accelerated. His right hand attacked the strings while his left hand moved rapidly across the fretboard. And still he kept singing. Someone whispered, "He's doing it." But then came the difficult passage. Daniel knew it was coming. His fingers reached the fastest section. At the same moment, he had to hit one of the highest vocal notes. His breathing became uneven. His fingers slipped. One wrong note rang through the room. Daniel froze. The music stopped. Silence. Daniel stared at the floor. His face turned red. "I'm sorry." Nobody moved. Daniel slowly removed the guitar from his shoulder. "I told you I could do it." His voice became quiet. "I guess I was wrong." He began walking away. Then Elvis spoke. "Stop." Daniel stopped. He turned around. Elvis wasn't angry. He wasn't laughing. He was looking at Daniel with an expression the young guitarist couldn't understand. Elvis walked toward him. "You think that was failure?" Daniel said nothing. Elvis pointed toward the guitar. "You made one mistake." "Yes, sir." "One." Elvis shook his head. "Do you know how many mistakes I've made?" Daniel looked up. Elvis smiled faintly. "More than I can count." A few musicians smiled. But Elvis wasn't joking anymore. He stepped closer. "The difference is, people remember the mistakes because they forget everything that came before them." Daniel looked at the floor. "I embarrassed myself." "No." Elvis shook his head. "You embarrassed your pride." Daniel looked confused. Elvis continued. "And that's a good thing." The room remained silent. Elvis took the guitar from Daniel. He held it for a moment. Then he handed it back. "Again." Daniel stared at him. "Again." "Yes, but I missed the note." "I heard you." "I can't do that passage." Elvis smiled. "Then don't try to prove you can." Daniel frowned. "Then what should I do?" Elvis looked directly into his eyes. "Tell the story." The band started again. This time something was different. Daniel wasn't trying to impress anyone. He wasn't trying to prove that he was the fastest guitarist in the room. He simply listened. The rhythm moved underneath him. His fingers followed. The notes became warmer, more controlled. And when he reached the difficult passage, he didn't attack it. He breathed. He bent the note. He let the guitar cry. Then he sang. The note wasn't perfect. It wasn't technically flawless. But it was honest. Elvis smiled. For the first time that evening, he stepped away from the microphone. He let Daniel continue. The young guitarist closed his eyes. He played as if nobody was watching. The room disappeared. The cameras disappeared. The famous musicians disappeared. There was only the guitar and the emotion inside it. When Daniel finished, nobody spoke. Then Elvis slowly began clapping. One clap, then another. Then the entire room erupted. Daniel opened his eyes. He looked stunned. Elvis walked toward him. Now, he paused. That was singing. Daniel smiled. But Elvis wasn't finished. He leaned closer and quietly said, "Tomorrow night, I want you on that stage." Daniel's smile disappeared. What? Elvis nodded. You heard me. Mr. Presley, I'm not ready. Elvis laughed softly. Neither was I. Daniel stared at him. And then Elvis said something that Daniel would remember for the rest of his life. Nobody is ready when the moment comes. He walked away. Daniel stood there holding the old guitar. His hands were shaking. He had come into the studio hopping to impress Elvis Presley. Instead, Elvis had given him something far more dangerous. A chance. And tomorrow night, thousands of people would be watching. But there was one problem. Daniel had never performed on a stage that big. And Elvis had just put him directly in front of the world. If you think Elvis made the right decision, like this story, comment, keep going, if you want to hear what happens when Daniel finally steps onto that stage. And don't forget to tell us what city or country you're watching from. Subscribe, because the moment Daniel walks onto that stage, Elvis is about to discover something even he didn't expect. The next morning, Daniel woke up before sunrise. For several seconds, he didn't know where he was. Then he remembered. Elvis Presley. The rehearsal. The challenge. The stage. Daniel sat on the edge of the bed and stared at his hands. They were trembling. He had played hundreds of times before. Small clubs, church halls, back rooms, local theaters. But tonight would be different. Tonight he would be standing beside Elvis Presley. And thousands of people would hear every note. Daniel picked up his guitar. He played the opening melody quietly. Everything sounded fine. Then he reached the difficult passage. His fingers stopped. He tried again. Another mistake. He closed his eyes. Come on. Again. This time he reached the passage. His fingers moved faster. His breathing stayed steady. He finished. Daniel smiled. Maybe he could do this. But then he remembered Elvis's words. Nobody is ready when the moment comes. Those words had stayed inside his mind all night. Back at the studio, the atmosphere was completely different. Technicians rushed from one side to another. Microphones were being tested. Cameras were positioned. Musicians tuned their instruments. Everyone knew the performance mattered. But Elvis looked unusually calm. He stood near the stage, watching everyone work. Daniel walked in carrying his guitar. Elvis immediately noticed him. There he is. Daniel smiled nervously. Morning. Elvis looked at the guitar. You practice all night? Elvis laughed. That's what I was afraid of. Daniel frowned. Why? Because sometimes practicing too much makes you forget how to feel. Daniel looked at him. Elvis walked closer. You don't need to be perfect tonight. Daniel nodded. But thousands of people will be watching. Elvis smiled. Then give them something worth watching. Daniel took a deep breath. Are you sure I should be doing this? Elvis looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, I wouldn't have asked if I wasn't. Those words gave Daniel enough confidence to stay. But neither of them knew what was about to happen. The hours passed quickly. As evening arrived, the venue began filling. People came dressed in their finest clothes. Some carried cameras. Some held programs. Some had waited years to see Elvis again. Backstage, Daniel could hear the crowd through the walls. Thousands of voices. The sound made his stomach tighten. He walked toward the curtain. He peeked through. The sight almost made him step backward. Rows and rows of people. Lights. Cameras. A sea of faces. Daniel whispered, This is insane. A voice behind him answered, Yep. Daniel turned. Elvis was standing there. Daniel smiled. How do you do this? Elvis shrugged. You breathe. Daniel laughed nervously. That's it. That's it. Elvis stepped beside him. Then you walk out there and remember why you're playing. Daniel looked at the audience. I don't know if I can. Elvis put a hand on his shoulder. Yes, you can. Then Elvis walked away. Daniel stood alone. The announcer's voice filled the theater. The crowd erupted. Elvis Presley walked onto the stage. The response was enormous. Daniel watched from behind the curtain. Elvis smiled at the audience. The cheers continued. Then the music began. Elvis performed with the confidence of a man who had spent his entire life under bright lights. His voice filled the room. The crowd sang along. Daniel watched. He forgot his fear for a moment. He simply admired the man standing on stage. Then Elvis looked toward the curtain. Their eyes met. Elvis gave him a small nod. Daniel's heart dropped. It was time. Daniel stepped onto the stage. The crowd didn't know who he was. Some people looked confused. A few whispered. Elvis walked toward him. Ladies and gentlemen. He paused. I want you to meet somebody. The audience became quiet. Elvis placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder. He's young. The crowd laughed. He's nervous. More laughter. And he thinks he knows everything about music. Daniel smiled. The audience laughed again. Elvis looked at him. You ready? Daniel whispered. No. Elvis smiled. Good. The band started. Daniel raised his guitar. The first notes came out clean. Then stronger. Then louder. The audience began paying attention. Daniel's confidence returned. His fingers moved across the fretboard. The sound filled the theater. Elvis stepped backward. He allowed Daniel to take the spotlight. Daniel looked toward him. Elvis simply nodded. Keep going. Daniel played harder. The audience began applauding. Then came the moment. The difficult passage. The same passage that had caused him to fail the previous day. Daniel felt his breathing change. His fingers approached the notes. 1, 2, 3. He hit them perfectly. The crowd erupted. Daniel's eyes widened. He kept playing. Then he began singing. His voice rose above the guitar. For a few seconds, everything seemed perfect. But suddenly, a string snapped. The sound was sharp. Daniel stopped. The audience gasped. He stared at the broken string. His worst nightmare had happened. On stage, in front of everyone, the band stopped. Silence. Daniel looked toward Elvis. Elvis looked back. For one terrifying second, Daniel thought the performance was over. Then Elvis walked toward him. He leaned close and whispered, "Don't stop." Daniel looked confused. "The guitar's broken." Elvis smiled. "Then sing." "Before we continue, let me ask you, what would you do if your guitar string snapped in front of thousands of people? Would you freeze? Would you keep singing? Comment "keep singing" if you would continue. And tell us where you're watching from, your city or country. If this story is keeping you hooked, hit like and subscribe. Because what Daniel did next made Elvis Presley do something nobody expected. Daniel looked at the audience, then at the broken string, then at Elvis. He took a breath. He put the guitar down. The musicians waited. Daniel stepped toward the microphone, and he sang. No guitar, no protection, just his voice. The first line came out softly. The theater became completely silent. Daniel continued. His voice wasn't perfect. It trembled slightly. But there was emotion. Real emotion. The kind that couldn't be manufactured. Elvis stood behind him, watching, listening. Then Daniel reached the highest section. His voice cracked. For half a second, he almost stopped. But he remembered Elvis's words. Tell the story. Daniel closed his eyes and continued. This time, the note came out stronger. The audience began applauding. One person, then another. Soon, the entire theater was clapping along. Daniel opened his eyes. He saw Elvis smiling. Not the famous Elvis smile. Something different. Something proud. The song ended. The room exploded. Daniel stood frozen. The applause continued. He looked at Elvis. Elvis walked toward him. Then, unexpectedly, Elvis removed his own microphone from the stand and handed it to Daniel. The crowd cheered even louder. Elvis said, "That." He paused. "That's what I was talking about." Daniel looked at him. "What?" Elvis smiled. "Feeling." Backstage after the performance, Daniel sat alone. His hands were still shaking. He couldn't believe what had happened. Elvis entered the room. Daniel immediately stood. "Mr. Presley." Elvis raised a hand. "Sit down." Daniel sat. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then Elvis looked at him. "You know what scared you tonight?" Daniel thought about it. The audience. Elvis shook his head. The possibility of failing. Daniel looked down. "Yes." Elvis nodded. "Everybody's afraid of that." He sat beside him. "But here's the secret." Daniel looked over. "What's that?" Elvis leaned back. Failure isn't the moment you miss a note. He paused. Failure is when you let that missed note convince you to stop. Daniel said nothing. Elvis looked at the broken guitar string lying on the table. Keep that. Daniel frowned. The string. Yes. Why? So you remember. Remember what? Elvis smiled. That sometimes the thing that breaks your plan becomes the thing that changes your life. Daniel picked up the string. He stared at it. Then Elvis stood. Get some sleep. Daniel smiled. I don't think I'll sleep tonight. Elvis laughed. Neither will I. He walked toward the door. Then stopped. Without turning around, he said, Tomorrow, we're doing something different. Daniel looked up. What? Elvis turned. You and me. Daniel's eyes widened. Together. Elvis smiled. Together. Then he left. Daniel remained frozen. He had entered the building as an unknown guitarist. Now Elvis Presley had invited him to share the stage again. But this time, Elvis had a completely different challenge in mind. And it wasn't about playing faster. It was about something much harder. Making an entire audience feel something they couldn't explain. Something Elvis himself had spent his entire life trying to capture. Something that would force Daniel to reveal the one thing he had been hiding from everyone, including himself. The next evening, Daniel arrived at the studio carrying the same guitar. The broken string from the previous performance had been replaced, but he had kept the old one in his pocket. It had become a reminder that everything could fall apart in 1 second. And sometimes, that was exactly when the real music began. Daniel walked into the rehearsal room. Elvis was already there. He was sitting quietly, staring at an empty stage. Daniel approached. You said we were doing something different. Elvis nodded. We are. What is it? Elvis pointed toward the stage. Tonight, there will be no big introduction. Daniel waited. No complicated arrangement. Elvis continued. No tricks. Daniel looked confused. Then what am I supposed to do? Elvis smiled. Sing something that scares you. Daniel's expression changed. Scares me. Yes. Elvis stood. Everybody can sing something they already know. He walked toward the microphone. But real artists eventually have to sing something that exposes them. Daniel lowered his eyes. He knew exactly what Elvis meant. There was one song he had written but never performed. A song about his father. His father had died when Daniel was 15. Daniel had written the song alone in his bedroom. He had never shown it to anyone. Not because it was bad. Because it was too personal. Elvis seemed to understand immediately. You have one. Daniel looked up. One what? One song you don't let anybody hear. Daniel said nothing. Elvis smiled. I've seen that look before. Daniel swallowed. My father. Elvis nodded. That's the one. Daniel stared at him. How did you know? Elvis looked away for a moment. Because I know what it's like to carry somebody inside a song. The room became quiet. Daniel finally took his guitar. He walked toward the microphone. His hands were shaking. He began to play. The melody was simple. No complicated solo. No impressive technique. Just a few quiet chords. Then Daniel began singing. His voice was almost a whisper. The song was about a boy who wanted his father to see him perform one more time. About an empty chair. About a voice that existed only in memory. About all the words that had never been said. Halfway through the song, Daniel's voice broke. He stopped. He looked down. I can't. Elvis didn't move. Daniel wiped his eyes. I'm sorry. Elvis walked toward him. He didn't tell Daniel to continue. He simply stood beside him. Then Elvis said quietly, You don't have to hide the tears. Daniel looked at him. People will think I'm weak. Elvis shook his head. No. He pointed toward the microphone. They'll think you're human. Daniel took a deep breath. He started again. This time, he didn't fight his emotions. He let them come. And when the final note disappeared into the room, Elvis was silent. For several seconds. Then he clapped once. Slowly. Daniel looked up. Elvis's eyes were wet. Daniel had never seen him like that. Elvis turned away quickly. But Daniel had already noticed. Mr. Presley. Elvis raised a hand. Don't. Daniel stopped. Elvis looked at him. That song. He paused. That's the kind of song people remember. If this moment touched you, take a second to hit like. Comment Music Heals if you've ever had a song remind you of someone you love. And tell us where you're watching from, your city or country. If you want more emotional stories about legendary musicians, subscribe. Because what Elvis told Daniel next wasn't about music at all. Elvis walked toward the window. Outside, the city lights were beginning to glow. He stood there quietly. Then he said, When I was young, I thought becoming famous would solve everything. Daniel listened. It doesn't. Elvis turned. Money doesn't. He paused. Fame doesn't. Another pause. And applause doesn't. Daniel asked, Then what does? Elvis smiled sadly. People. Daniel waited. The people who believe in you when nobody else does. He looked at Daniel. That's why I brought you here. Daniel was stunned. Because you believed in me. Elvis nodded. Because I saw something. What? Elvis pointed toward Daniel's guitar. Talent gets attention. Then he pointed toward Daniel's chest. But truth gets remembered. Daniel looked down. Elvis continued. You don't need to become another Elvis. Daniel smiled. Good. Elvis laughed. I don't think the world could handle two of me. They both laughed. Then Elvis became serious. Be Daniel. Those 3 words stayed with him. Be Daniel. Not faster. Not louder. Not more famous. Just honest. The next time Daniel stepped onto the stage, he wasn't trying to impress anyone. He played the song about his father. Elvis stood nearby. The audience listened in complete silence. When Daniel finished, there was no immediate applause. For a moment, there was nothing. Then one person stood. Then another. Then another. Within seconds, the entire room was standing. Daniel looked overwhelmed. Elvis walked toward him. He placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder. The applause became thunderous. Daniel looked at Elvis. Elvis whispered, Now you understand. Daniel nodded. What? Elvis smiled. Music isn't about making people hear you. He looked toward the audience. It's about making them feel less alone. Daniel's eyes filled with tears. The 2 men stood there together. One was already a legend. The other was only beginning. But for one brief moment, they were simply two musicians who understood the same language. Music. And somewhere beneath the applause, Daniel finally understood why Elvis had challenged him in the first place. It was never about whether he could sing over a difficult guitar solo. It was never about speed. It was never about perfection. Elvis had been testing something much deeper. Could Daniel keep playing when everything went wrong? Could he sing when his hands were shaking? Could he turn pain into music? Could he tell the truth when thousands of people were listening? That was the real challenge. And Daniel had finally passed it. Years later, whenever people asked him about the most important night of his life, he never talked about the applause. He never talked about the cameras. He never talked about standing beside Elvis Presley. He always talked about one broken guitar string. He kept it for decades, because that tiny piece of metal reminded him of the greatest lesson Elvis had ever taught him. Sometimes the moment you think your music has broken is the moment your real voice finally begins. And perhaps that was Elvis Presley's greatest gift. Not teaching Daniel how to sing. Not teaching him how to perform. But teaching him that perfection was never the goal. Truth was. So if you ever find yourself afraid to sing, afraid to create, afraid that one mistake will ruin everything, remember Daniel. Remember the broken string. And remember Elvis's words. Don't stop. Because sometimes the world isn't waiting for you to be perfect. It's waiting for you to be real. If this story moved you, hit like. Comment where you're watching from and tell us whether a song has ever reminded you of someone you love. And subscribe for more emotional stories about the legends who changed music forever.